Julia Gray. I'm the Executive Director here at the Newsom Museum. Welcome to this afternoon's program. Just a reminder to everyone that here in what we present day call Casting, we're in the heart of the homeland of the Penobscot Nation and the Wabanaki Confederacy. Excited to welcome longtime friend and colleague Bonnie Newsom to share some of the wonderful work that she does around Indigenous people and how we can connect with them through the archaeological record. Dr. Newsom is a citizen of the Penobscot Nation and an Indigenous archaeologist interested in pre-contact lifeways of Native people in what is now Maine. She's an assistant professor at the University of Maine in the Anthropology Department and has her PhD from UMass and MS in Paternity Studies and BA in Anthropology from the University of Maine. Her research has focused largely on the Penobscot River Valley and people living here during what archaeologists call the ceramic period, roughly 3,000 to 250 years ago. Through her research, Bonnie seeks to humanize people in the past by exploring concepts of identity, style, social boundaries, and human agency. Most recently, her research has focused on population distinctions in pre-contact Maine through an analysis of potters' choices in the manufacture of Aboriginal ceramics from coastal interior settings. And she has been a wonderful influence on those us that do archaeology to use new language and how powerful it is to use new language when we talk about the past, especially through archaeological data. And in addition to that, Bonnie has been a friend and a valued colleague of mine for, oh no, something like 30 years. Wow. She generously offers guidance and feedback that has enabled me to be a better partner with Wabanaki people in my archaeological, anthropological, and museum work. In addition, we want to do an extra thank you to Bangor Savings Bank, who is sponsoring our Connecting Collections program series. This program is part of the Pottery Shaping Clay Shaping Culture segment of Connecting Collections. So thank you, Bangor Savings Bank, for supporting the program at the Newsom Museum. And I'll turn it over to Bonnie.
Thank you, Julia. Everyone. Kwe, Bonnie Newsom Mill Kiwis, Nagabon Wolf Scaradale. Hello. I wanted to use some of my Penobscot language to introduce myself. My name is Bonnie Newsom, and I'm a citizen of the Penobscot Nation, as Julia said. Nudalkit is the word for archaeologist, and that's what I do. And it's also the word for digger. It's a way for me to make sure that we remember that the people that using the language, I try to make sure that I acknowledge those that came before us, and that we are only getting a little piece of the picture when we're looking at material culture through the archaeological record. Language is vitally important in understanding how people perceive their world. And so I'm not a fluent speaker, but I certainly do try to use language as much as possible because it is very fragile. So tonight or today, I'm going to be talking about Wabanaki ceramics. And for those of you who don't know, Wabanaki is from the indigenous term Wabanaki, which is people of the dawn or people of first light. And the Wabanaki people here in Maine include the Maliseet, the Fulton area, the Micmac, who are up near Presque Isle, or they're actually Mi'kmaq Nation. They just officially changed their name back to their indigenous language. The Passamaquoddies who live down east, and the Penobscot Nation. And so collectively we refer to ourselves as the Wabanaki. And the Wabanaki Confederacy is a confederacy where we come together on issues of common interest or need, and we are not bound to that confederacy. We have the option to leave or return anytime as needed or as we feel is needed. And in terms of Wabanaki communities leaving, we haven't had any of that, but we do often come together on issues. And that's really strengthened us, I think. We work very hard at reclaiming our indigenous past and some of the traditions and cultural values that were impacted by colonization. And so part of this work for me, working with ceramics, is to start to bring that back to indigenous people today. And for a long time, people have not made ceramics in this area. when Europeans came over, they brought metal pots, and people started making and using metal pots, not all for cooking. Sometimes they use the metal for different things, to make arrowheads and tinkling cones on dresses and other things. But the pottery tradition really declined when Europeans contacted or came into this settled area. So I'm going to talk about Wabanaki ceramics, and this is going to be a very introductory talk. And
Bonnie,
yes.
Before you get too much further, we're getting some feedback from our Zoom audience that the audio is being a little bit finicky and breaking up. They've asked if we could try to reposition the microphone closer. I don't know if that's possible.
Maybe if I lift it up a little bit.
We can try it. Let's see. How is that?
Does that work? Is that any better? I'll start, and if it's still giving us trouble, then we can readjust.
Okay.
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 So I want to start first by talking about Maine's glacial history. And why would we want to talk about Maine's glacial history in terms of ceramics? Well, in part because it illustrates how long people have actually been here in Maine. So about 14,000 years ago, Maine was covered with ice. And at 13,000 years ago, it was covered with ice and seawater. And so what happened was the ice was so heavy it depressed the landscape, and seawaters came in. And when those seawaters came in, and you can see the boundary here, when those seawaters came in, they deposited a beautiful marine sediment called Presumpscot Formation. And that Presumpscot Formation, we think, served as a basis for clay, the clay that we see people making pots out of. And so that process that the earth underwent during that time actually helped us as Indigenous peoples have a resource to make clay pots. Now, 12,000 years ago, ice was in northern Maine. There was tundra in central Maine, and mixed woodlands along the coast. And this is where we really begin to see evidence of people living in Maine early on. One of the things I like to do as an archaeologist is to counterbalance the scientific narrative with oral tradition. And so for us as Wabanaki people, we view ourselves as being from here since time immemorial. And one of the narratives that tells that story is about Gluskab. And Gluskab is a culture hero of the Wabanaki communities. And Gluskab is responsible for us being here today. What he did was he shot an arrow into an ash tree, and from that ash tree, the people emerged. And so we, as Indigenous peoples, view this as our homeland and look to it with a deep respect because of the long ties that we have here. And so this is why Maine's glacial history is important. Number one, because it left us with some beautiful clays that we can make and create clay pots out of, but also because it is only one story or a narrative in how people came to be in Maine. So, but I like to counterbalance that with how Indigenous peoples view themselves in their history as well. So ceramics, though, even though there was all this wonderful clay in Maine, ceramics didn't come in until about 3,000 years ago. And so about 3,000 years ago, people decided to start making and using clay pots. And in this, archaeologists have termed this as the ceramic period. And it's characterized specifically by the use and manufacture of ceramic vessels. Before this time, people weren't using ceramics. They weren't making clay pots and weren't using clay. And so this was a really major technological shift for Wabanaki people. And it transformed their world. If you think about life in Maine prior to ceramics, you might think they cooked in birch bark containers, perhaps had to heat things by adding rocks to whatever they were trying to heat up. However, when clay pots came along, they were able to cook food and without direct. So that was a pretty important shift. They were also able to store food as well and protect food. And so clay pots are probably a really one of the most important innovations that we see in Maine archaeology. However, they haven't gotten the attention that they deserve, in my opinion, in terms of archaeology. Very few of us are doing archaeological analysis on ceramics these days. And I think it really does a disservice to this technology and understanding how important clay pots were. So archaeologists have divided the ceramic period into 7 sub-periods. And this reflects changes in ceramic style through time. And so just like houses and cars and other material culture changes through time, clay pots did too. And they're a good indicator of certain time periods. So when you know the sequence of how pots change through time, you can begin to identify what other things might date to that same time period. And so it's really important. It was a really useful and important contribution to Maine archaeology to break down the time periods. And we're going to talk about each of those individually. So one of the sources for many of the ceramics that we see in Maine today from archaeological context comes from Maine shell middens, is what they're typically known as. I prefer the term shell heap because the term midden actually represents garbaging behavior, which we know that in some cases, these shell heaps may not have been simply garbage dumps. And so, but these are spaces, cultural spaces along Maine's coastline that reflect past human accumulation of shell and often associated with harvesting shellfish. And these sites are not unique to Maine. There are shell heaps all over the world, both in coastal and riverine settings. They appear to be restricted to coastal areas here in Maine, but most of these shell heaps document the last 3,000 years of Wabanaki life. And not only do we see evidence of people's material culture, but we also can reconstruct past environments because the shell actually helps to preserve things like food bone remains, so you can tell what species were in Maine at certain times. You'll get a hearth feature perhaps that may have some charcoal and plant remains. So those kinds of information are really preserved well in these sites. So this is an image of the whaleback shell heap in Damariscotta, Maine. It's about 30 feet deep, more than 30 feet deep. And so, yeah.
May I interrupt this question?
Sure. Okay? I'll ask, is that okay?
It's fine with
us. Yeah.
Okay. So you said they weren't just, being thrown away as garbage or,
right.
We're not using them anymore. So what other uses did they have?
So sometimes we'll find, or they have found in the past, human cemeteries. Also have found ritual dog burial. We find house floors associated with these sometimes. And so there are all these other activities that are going on in this space that is differs from kind of a garbage. So that's why we know that they're much more. And if you were to go to the Damariscotta area and see these and travel down the Damariscotta River, what you'll see, would have seen back then, are 2 huge mountains of shell. And these, I think, may have been some sort of marker or some sort of way to identify this place as important. So one of the stories that we have about these is from Joseph Nicolar's Life and Tradition of the Red Man. And Joseph Nicolar was a Penobscot leader who actually wrote a book in the 1800s, and he self-published it. And it's a narrative of indigenous worldview and stories. So one of the stories that he tells in that book is how these shells represent a time when people engaged with, these happen to be oysters. And what Joseph Nicolar says is that as the story goes, people from the South wanted to access our oysters, and the Wabanaki people let them. So people would come, access the oysters, and they could do that as long as they didn't hurt our weak or elderly. And so there were stipulations about how people could engage with these oyster beds. And one of the things that that tells us is a kind of a different way of looking at the resource than perhaps, you know, as an economic way for an individual to make a living. And so the resource was shared. And so that's a very different philosophy in terms of how we think about shellfish than what we might see in other kinds of social settings. So this is, if you have not ever been to Damariscotta, it's worth the trip. The whaleback was mined in the 1800s for chicken feed supplement. So they went in and they took, and road fill. So they went in and they took out a lot of the shell, and some archaeologists did a little bit of monitoring and tried to collect stuff before it all went to Boston and other places. But for the most part, that shell heap is mostly gone now. And then, but on the other side of the river is the Glidden Midden, what it's called. The landowner at the time refused to let anybody do any mining of those shell heaps. And so that shell heap remains intact. And so I think one of the things to think about in terms of conservation is we're very fortunate to have the Glidden Midden because of the forward thinking of the landowner. So back to ceramics. We do have ceramics from shell heaps all over Maine. And one of the things that we know is about these coiled pots is that they're made from local clay. They tend to be open fired. They include things like grit or crushed stone, crushed shell, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of these when I wrap up, and an organic temper. And temper is added to the clay in order to improve pot performance or maybe strengthen it in some way. We know that Wabanaki potters use different kinds of decoration or surface treatment on the pots. So they impress fabrics on the exterior of the pot. They use tooth implements, and I'll talk more about these. They made their own cordage and wrapped it around sticks and imprinted it on the pot. So these are ways that we as archaeologists can view some artistic expression in the past. We also know that there's a distinction in pottery on the coast and interior with regard to some of those impressions, and I'll talk more about this. This is a Catawba potter at about 1908, and we think that the process here would have been very similar. Coil pots, open fired, no evidence of kilns. So the potters probably worked very much like the Catawba potters did recently as well. So these are some fragments of clay pots that we have recovered from Maine. And as you'll note, the decoration or the surface treatment changes through time. And our earliest pottery is here. That's fabric impressed interior and exterior. So some of the first pots. And then we see a variety of different decorations. And as I mentioned before, these change through time. So in 1991, a couple archaeologists from Maine decided to organize ceramics in a chronological order. And so they devised the 7-part subdivisions, and these are the time periods represented, and these are how the designs change through time. And I'm not going to go over those here, but I will talk about each time period and each different quote unquote type of pot that people made. And so pottery, as I mentioned, started about 3,000 years ago, and at European contact, it faded away. This is the earliest type of pottery that we have here in Maine. It's called Vinet 1, and it's very, as you can see, it has a particular style of a pointed base. It tends to be very thick. It has additives or inclusions in the clay that people added a lot of crushed rock to this kind of pot. The colors tend to be buff or reddish brown, gray to black. Interiors tend to be gray to black. And when you fire a pot, oftentimes they would turn them upside down. And so what that does is that restricts the oxygen that can get into the pot, and the inside of the pot will become black. And so all of these colors can actually tell you a little bit about the firing process as well as the clay origins. So this surface treatment, they would take a paddle and wrap cordage around the paddle and paddle the exterior and the interior of the pot. And what that does, it's not simply decoration, but that helps to consolidate the coil. And it's a manufacturing strategy that they're using to make a better pot. Rims tend to be straight, not very fancy, and bodies tend to be elongated. And this is an example from Quebec. And the interesting thing about this kind of pottery is that it's found all over the Northeast. And so what you can see here is this, all of these spots, all of these reference points show where this pottery has been found. The amazing thing about this time period is there's very little variation in how people are making their pots. And if you think about clay as a very malleable kind of substance, you can do anything you want really when you're working clay. But for some reason, everybody in the Northeast are making their pots the same way. They're using the fabric impressed interior exterior, and they're also shaped the same. So it's one of the questions that archaeologists are trying to understand. Why are we seeing this type of pottery that has very little variability across such a large region? So in 1991, Peterson and Sanger, who were both archaeologists here in Maine, they interpreted this as shared ceramic traits. They interpreted it as a horizon style, which was indicative of this kind of widespread social interaction. And so one of the problems with this, though, is that few people have actually looked at the details of the pot. And if you look at the details of this type of pottery, you begin to see some differences in what people are using for temper, how thick they're making their pots. So there are variabilities, but because archaeologists, tend to like to lump things together that are the same, they forget to look for other variations. So at about 2,000 years ago, people changed how they decided to decorate or surface treat their pots. They shift to what's called a roccardente style, and it's a toothed implement, kind of like a comb, and they would rock it on the surface of the pot. And if you look, you can kind of see how they would rock back and forth on certain areas. And so you can do that in any random kind of way. But as you can see by this example, they actually took the time to rock a pattern into it. And so we haven't done a lot of research on looking at the differences in those patterns, but it certainly does suggest that there was some artistic expression. It wasn't simply just a surface treatment. Later on, so during this time period at about 1650, for some reason, people start using tools with bigger teeth. They also make thicker pots, which may indicate a different use for the pot. So in terms of thickness, if you have a thick pot, that's easier for moving around. It makes it more hardy. So thin pots tend to probably break more. So it's those kinds of things that when you're looking at a pot, archaeologically, you begin to think, okay, how is this pot going to, how was this pot used? What did this pot get used for? So for some reason, they're making thicker pots at this time. And then at about 1350, the entire decorative scheme changes, and people are using a technique called cord wrap stick. And cord wrap stick is exactly what it sounds like. They would take a piece of cordage that they made and they imprint it on the pot. And you can see here, this is the cordage imprint here. And they add these little, oftentimes circular punctings as well. That's just an example of what that might look like as a tool. And people made their own cordage, probably out of basswood bark or other things. Milkweed, I make cordage out of milkweed fibers. And so you can see evidence of all of that just in the surface of the pot. They also started during this time, instead of having crushed stone to temper their pot, they started crushing shell and adding crushed shell to the pots as well. Oops, I think I missed one. Nope, I didn't. I missed putting a slide in. Ceramic period 5 is very similar to ceramic period 4. They tend to get a little thinner, and they also tend to use a more narrow cordage. And so we know that because of that, it's a different time period. So during ceramic period 6, they go back to paddling again, but they're not paddling the interior of the pot like they did earlier on, just the exterior. And the pots tend to get very, very thin. And so the last ceramic period, about 400 years ago, until the practice was abandoned, it incised lines. And these are very reminiscent of what you might see in Iroquois country. And the morphology of these pots are also different. We start to see big collars around the rim, lots of decoration around the rim. And one of the interpretations of that is that if you have a longhouse and you have your pots kind of in various places within that longhouse in different fires, you can tell which pot is yours or which pot belongs to your family based on the design around the rim. If you're sitting maybe suspended or sitting within the pot. And so that rim area is really important if you're looking for identity signature. In addition to the surface treatments, we also see a number of other attributes that we use to help understand why people are making pots the way they are. We, as archaeologists, we look at the rim, very important, because if you have a vessel that you want to pour from, the rim is going to be very different than something that you want to store things in. You know, you want to be able to get your hands or your spoon or whatever into a cooking pot, so your rim is going to be different. Some places in the Southwest, some potters will make seed pots where they just a very tiny hole in the top, and that is to protect the seeds, and so your hands can't get in it, critters can't get in it. We also look at surface treatment. This is a collar, kind of a raised edge around the rim. And we also look at things like temper and the paste consistency. So all of these are attributes that we as archaeologists study in order to understand how the pots are made and used. We can also do a residue analysis. Very often what we'll find, and I think we have some examples here of pots with residues, but what we find is that there's food crust left on many of these sherds. And so what that can tell us is not only what people were eating, but what kinds of species, what kind of plants perhaps were in the environment at that time. And so there are a few techniques that we use to test residues, GCMS, which I'm not going to try to pronounce. That is actually, it looks at lipids and proteins, and FTIR uses an infrared process to also analyze the chemical makeup of the residue. So as I mentioned, we also look at surface treatment in terms of portage. And in Maine, we see a pattern in how people are, what people are using for surface treatment. So this is a portage fragment from Vermont, and it's recovered from a site there. And so one of the things, if you've never made portage, what it does is it retains a spin and twist pattern. And so like typing, it becomes muscle memory. And so your portage makers will have a signature spin and twist. And sometimes there's only two ways you can do it. Sometimes it's on S twist, and sometimes it's the Z twist. I'm going to pass this around and apologize for the folks online. But this is an example of milkweed cordage. How does that look? Okay.
Yeah, you can get a little closer.
Milkweed cordage that I made yesterday. And it shows here that it's a Z twist, and I don't know because the angle goes, it might be backwards, but I'll pass this around and you can take a look at it and see how that works. But we can actually see that in pottery as well. So as archaeologists, we also, one of the ways that we can get a better visual of this is through clay imprints on the surface of the pot. So we'll take some clay, we'll imprint it on the surface, and you can see here, this strand happens to have knots in it, cord wrap stick, and you can actually, on this one here, you can actually see the stick. So it gives a good window into some of the fiber perishable technologies that Wabanaki people were using. So why is this a big deal? Well, this is the distribution of the twist patterns that we see in Maine. I'm going to just go a little closer here. So chronologically, James Peterson, who is an archaeologist here in Maine, identified distinctions in coastal and interior portage. patterns during the early ceramic period. Remember that Binet 1, and then again during ceramic period 4, which is about 1350 to 950 BC. And so this is the pattern. People on the coast were twisting their cordage in one direction, and people on the interior were twisting it in another direction. And so what Peterson suggested was that this represented different learning networks within Maine. And so people were learning how to do their cordage in two different networks. Perhaps even there may be some sort of identity differences between the coast and interior. And we can tell all this from pottery, which is really exciting. Yes.
I've always sort of understood that people moved a lot coming to the coast in the summer and north in the winter, which makes sense when you really think about it. So we don't see that. Interestingly, that's a common understanding of how people organize themselves on the landscape, but we don't see that archaeologically. We see that people are actually living on the coast during multiple times of the year, and that they're not necessarily moving from the coast to the interior. So we used to think that people aligned themselves with river valleys, and I think some of that happened. But certainly I think there's something else going on that is keeping people perhaps moving from the mainland to the islands. That might be a movement, but people are generally, I think, on the coast most of the time. Yeah.
But if you look at this and you see where there's Z and S together, and it's mostly along the coast, and it's usually where a river is coming down. So there was that there is some interaction there.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And I don't disagree with that at all. In fact, we know we have sites that show kind of this interaction. But one of the things, if I were to take a collection of ceramics from the interior and check the cordage twist, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be an S twist, which is, why is that? I mean, there could be gender protocols, could be taboos, for example. So there's been a lot of research on cordage twists. And one of the things that we know is that in certain societies, it's a taboo to twist your cordage in a way that you weren't trained in. So, but, we're human. And so people are going to try it and do things that maybe they shouldn't. And that's what happens. And so they've even looked at things like left and right-handedness to think about whether or not that might influence it. If that were the case, you would expect the distribution of left and right-handed people to kind of be the same, both on the coast and the interior. And then, so you might see a little more variability if it was handedness. Yes.
Were you able to discern what they used, like maybe milkweed or whatever?
The only way we can do that is if we find fragments of the material itself, and they don't preserve very well. I mean, the one from Vermont, we're very lucky to have that fragment. We may have a few fragments around the state of fibers, but no. So the plot thickens a little bit. Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to show, and I failed to put in another slide, but is that at about 1350, or just about 950, I guess, what happens is everybody starts twisting their cordage in a Z-twist. So Z-twist becomes dominant all across Maine, as does shell temper. So people start adding shell temper about 1350. Eventually, it sweeps the pottery making tradition in Maine. So what gives, right? we don't know. And, you know, that's okay, but we're, you know, exploring those kinds of questions. What might prompt people to change something that is so ingrained in people to shift how they practice making portage and practice making their pots as well. So it could be that people became specialized in making clay pots, and it was something that was traded for. So you have a group of specialists who make pots and trade those pots. And so then what you get is, you know, more uniformity across the population if there are people who are making pots and distributing through some sort of economic exchange. Yes.
We have a question from our online audience, which is, what plants were used as the basis of portage primarily beyond milkweed?
Probably basswood bark is what I've seen most evidence of. Yeah. Julia, do you have any other than basswood bark?
Basswood or cedar, maybe.
Cedar. Yeah. No. I think you can do nettles too. I think nettles makes pretty good fiber as well.
And another question, is there oral history on the origin story? Why did people want to learn how to do this kind of work? Who was the first to try it?
No. No, unfortunately we don't. I think there may be some reference to clay pots in Life and Traditions of the Red Man, but you know, we don't have any good oral narratives that can accompany our, at least none that I've found.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So one of the other areas that can tell us a lot about pottery making and why people are making pots the way they are is temper. And this is any material, it could be mineral or organic. It's usually non-plastic that's added to the clay to improve its working, drying, and firing properties. So in Maine, we see a couple different kinds of additives. One, it happens to be shell, which we talked about, and that at about 950, 1350, somewhere around there, that sweeps Maine. Everybody's using shell temper. We also see grit, which is usually crushed granite. Crushed granite is exactly as it sounds. Oftentimes you'll see that granite gets rotted and it starts to break down. People would crush it up and add it to the clay in order to improve pot performance. So we see a lot of crushed granite. Mostly the pots that we see here in Maine are tempered with that material. We also, recent finding in down East Maine was balsam fir needles. And this is an example of an imprint that is within the matrix, the clay matrix of the pot of balsam fir. And the interesting thing about this is that this kind of temper, we haven't tested all over the state, but we found it in an area where the environment during that time, about 3,000 years ago, was a mixed fir forest. And so they're using balsam fir to temper their pots. Not sure if it's for aroma, not sure if it's for performance, but it's a new finding. And again, if we're just looking at a pot based on a particular type, your analysis wouldn't pick that up normally. And sometimes you get pots that aren't tempered hardly at all. So these are all various choices in the tempering process. The more temper you put into a pot, oftentimes the stronger it is mechanically. Thinner pots tend to be good for cooking. So there are all kinds of differences that we can see in the pottery that can give us clues as to what they were used for. So to kind of wrap up here, I wanted to talk a little bit about how sophisticated this technology is. Sometimes I've seen in the literature that archaeologists refer to this pottery as crude. Earlier on in archaeological history, was referred to as primitive. So it's not that. These pots are created from the choices and needs of the potters. And potters make pots specifically to meet their needs and the needs of their family. So they had to have a deep understanding of a lot of different aspects of pottery making. They had to know the firing process in order to have a successful pot. They had to understand how the morphology or the shape of a pot actually would help them cook, help them carry, help them store, how it would fire even. Sometimes the morphology of your pot or the shape has particular firing advantages. And then they also had to have a deep understanding of the ingredients. And many people refer to these ingredients going into the pot as recipes. And if you think about recipes for biscuits that you may have or your family may have and pass down, oftentimes those will vary from person to person. And so these recipes for pots are something that people made because of what they needed the pot to do. And so I think as we move on in kind of our understanding of archaeological ceramics, what we can begin to think about is beyond the surface decoration, because there's so much more that a clay pot can tell you about the maker and the cultural context of that pottery tradition. So we haven't made pottery as Wabanaki people in Maine, but we are working to kind of revitalize this pottery tradition. And this is one of my goals as an archaeologist, is to bring some of this information back to the communities in order to reconnect them with this really, really important technological craft that they that helped us to be here today, right? So all of those pots help to feed our babies and our families. And so I want other Wabanaki people to embrace this tradition as much as the basket tradition is as vital. So with that, I'll just talk a little bit about the acknowledgements, and I do have some show and tell, and we'll try and figure out how to do that so that people on Zoom can also see that. But first and foremost, I always thank Wabanaki peoples, both past and present, for our ancestors having taken such good care of the land and materials and the traditions. We wouldn't be here today. So I always acknowledge them first and foremost. Maine State Museum has been supportive in terms of providing samples for me to analyze. Paleo Research Institute out of Golden, Colorado has done some residue analysis for me. And Maine Academic Prominence Initiative is a grant that helps to run my archaeology program at the University of Maine, where a lot of this research is taking place. So, and with that, those are my references, and I will end the slideshow now. And I want to show you, I don't know how best to do this, but we have examples. I brought teaching kits. Maybe what I'll do is I will pass these around here. I'll show first. So I don't have any Vanette 1 or CP1 pottery, but we will start with any. You can feel free to touch these. We don't have any provenience on these. We don't know really where they're from other than from Maine, so I use them in teaching. But these are examples of the different time periods and the decoration and surface treatment of each time period. So the first one I'll send around is ceramic period 2. And it looks like this. And if you can see, there's the surface treatment. How does that look?
Okay, we can get a little closer to see the fine details on the bottom. Yep. Nice. Yeah, that's good.
And this is what the interior looks like.
Nice, yep.
So I'll pass this around and you can, we'll pass around and you can take a look.
Can you say how big is your sample? How many potsherds do you find from a shell?
Yeah.
How many potsherds do you find from any other kinds of funds?
So the largest collection of potsherds that I've worked with thus far is probably from the Turner Farm site, which is on North Haven Island. There are 23 vessels, and that's only for the first time period. And so it varies. You can find 1 or 2 sherds at a site, or you could find hundreds of sherds at a site. It just a lot depends on the preservation and some of the other factors that go into what we find archaeologically.
Can I ask you, is there universal agreement as to what a type is? And is there a big fight between other types?
No, not at all. Not here in Maine. I think everybody's pretty on board with this chronology. And so we don't see a lot of debate around the chronology. It seems to fit really well.
Is there much overlap from one period to the next?
Yes, there is.
Most often you'll see, like very rarely do you see something that's just one ceramic period. It's almost always like, this is CP23, or this is P4, or this is 4 5. There's a lot of that.
There is.
Archaeologists are really good at equivocating.
Yes. So there is, you know, places where, you know, you do see some kind of overlap. What we don't see a lot of, though, is like you'll have a tooth implement design with a cord wrap stick. You don't see a lot of those together once in a while, but normally they're pretty restricted too.
We have many attributes. Do you analyze the sequence of attributes or the distribution of attributes?
Yes, absolutely. So we analyze the size of the temper, how much temper is put in a pot. We analyze the type of temper. We analyze the thickness in various places on the pot. We analyze the color. So all of the attributes are combined. And what we'll do is normally we'll take all the sherds and we'll construct vessel lots.
So do you end up with a lot of subtypes, or you don't do it that way?
No, we don't. It's all, usually what we'll do is we'll bring those attributes together and use them to not only analyze and answer questions, but to help us reconstruct particular vessels within any given site. So you may have 100 sherds, but that may only comprise 1 or 2 vessels, maybe 5 vessels. Yeah.
So right here in Castine, our Faulkner from the museum, the university did a dig.
Mm-hmm.
And so did he find any pottery when he was doing it? I think I only remember that they were finding pipes.
Yeah. And most of those were,
I'm
sorry, most of those were after European contact. I think there may be some pre-contact materials from that site, and I'd have to look at the collection, but for the most part, everything at that location is post-contact. Here and then here.
A question on Zoom is, has anything close to an intact pot been found?
Absolutely. So I've seen one intact pot that was recovered from by a diver at Stable Lake. And it didn't have any surface treatment. So, but it was beautiful, little small pot, kind of rounded.
Do you think it was worn away, or is it just, it wasn't? No.
Sometimes you find them that don't have any surface treatment at all. So we couldn't really tell. Yeah. So other examples? Yeah. Oh yeah, sorry.
You mentioned fabric several times.
Yeah.
Was that fabric that was the weaving going on
here
as well?
Absolutely. You can actually see weaving designs in some of the pots. So people were actually weaving, they were making fishnets, all kinds of things that they could have used to imprint. Yeah.
You mentioned that the pots were used to store items. Is there any idea about if there was a cover over those? Like, were they left open, or was,
No, we don't see any evidence of covers at all. Yeah, so what we will see sometimes are pots that curve in. So the rim will actually curve in a bit, which may be more conducive to something that you want to store something in rather than for.
Okay.
Let's see if I've got a couple other examples here. I'm going to shift up a little bit, and this is cord wrap stick. And you can see that this happens to be a rim sherd, and you can see how the rim is there. And then what you have here is cord wrap stick decoration, and then they would take a stick or something and make punctates or little circular things inside on the surface of the pot. And so this dates to ceramic period 4. And you can see that's very different from the last example that we passed around. And let's go. So this is an example of what we see when we see residues on ceramic pots. So as I mentioned, oftentimes you'll see cooked materials on the exterior surface of a pot, or excuse me, interior, sometimes the exterior. But if you look right here, you can see,
go up a little bit. Yep, there you go.
You can see little incrustations on there. And so that's food remains, probably fish. We know that people, we expect that people started making and using clay pots to cook fish in. And I'll pass it on over to you too. It's kind of hard to see.
Well, it's really cool. Not here, but in other parts of the world, they've been able to recreate like beer recipes based on residues on the inside of clay vessels. So.
Yep. So in terms of morphology or the shape of a pot, what you get very often is a pointed base, particularly early on. And when I make pots with people, what I'll do oftentimes is I'll start it and I'll put it on my elbow in order to get that little divot started. But this shows the pointed base. You see that okay?
Yep.
And then if you look on the inside here, this is all granite temper. And this is stuff that the potter would have added to the clay in order to improve pot performance.
What's the name of the beer company?
Dogfish Head. The Dogfish Head Brewery has their archaeological beers.
Ah, okay. Dogfish Head.
Some of them are good.
Brewery has anthropology.
They're archaeological beers.
So this is an example of a fabric impressed exterior. This is probably late ceramic period 6. Can you see the fabric on there very well?
Yeah, especially if you tilt it a little. Yeah. Oh yeah, perfect.
Yeah. And you can actually tell what twist this probably is. I probably can't. My eyes aren't that good. And
we have a few more questions online.
Okay, I'm happy to answer.
Okay. First question is, are there contemporary Wabanaki potters working on revival? Is this initiative based at UMO?
Yes. So we are just recently started a project with Wabanaki Youth Science and making clay pots with them and bringing in science and understanding the science of the ceramics as well. So it's very new, and we are working to introduce that to our young people and artists.
Nice.
Yes, I hope that it will become a practice that will complement our basket industry. And so particularly with climate change, you know, the trees change. And so, but clay is pretty good. I mean, you can have that tradition, and it's pretty stable, right? We're not quite as subject to climate change as maybe the ash tree is. This is another piece of pottery. It's called pseudo scallop shell. Oh, I'll remind me, and I'll make sure you all get to see that. But this is CP2 about 2,100 years ago, and they would instead of kind of a rocker dentate, they would make a tool that looked like a scallop shell, and you can actually see it on that.
Is there any burnishing going on?
Sometimes we see evidence of a little bit of burnishing going on as well.
Another question online. What advantage did the point face add to the pots? Did it allow them to sit in the fire better?
Absolutely. We think that's exactly why people made pointy face. It is easy to sit in the fire. You can prop some rocks around it and heat it.
Nice.
Anything else? So I would invite you all to come up and take a look at some of the collection that the Wilson Museum has here. They brought out some samples of things that I'll just show this to the audience. I'm sorry, you can't see. Sometimes you'll get.
Can we take the lid off so that
Okay.
and we can adjust that down. We're going on a field trip. We can move it.
So we can't touch these.
Let's see. Pretty good. You're showing the bottom quadrant, so
This quadrant,
or the bottom half, I guess. So now you're in the whole thing. Yep. And then can you zoom in one closer?
So this collection is probably middle ceramic period, which is ceramic period 2 through 5, maybe. And you can see there's a little bit of unique decoration or surface treatment here. This looks like it might be porcupine quill. You see that sometimes that people are putting, using porcupine quills to make little punctates. You see some incised lines here. This is a nice collared piece of rim shirt. So there's a lot that can be said about this collection, you know, through an analysis. And I think it's, you know, we know it's from Nautilus Island, right? And so we talk a lot about what people were doing with the pottery.
Nice. So do you want to like zoom in and then go across so that way they can get a close up? Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
And at first glance, these shirts don't look like much. But when you start to really analyze them and think about the people who are making them and why they're making the choices that they're making, they become very alive and interesting. I'm going to leave this, I think, up here, and if folks want to come up and take a look, and I can answer questions.
Nice, that's good.
There's a lot of other materials up here too that we can talk about if anybody has an interest. So, are there any other questions either on Zoom or otherwise?
Not yet. Zoom is.
Back up here.
Oh, yeah, perfect.
Thank you all for being so patient in Zoom world. I'm glad you're here, and happy to answer any other questions that anybody has.
So have you found islands to be a particularly rich place for finding things?
Yeah.
You said maybe North Haven.
Haven.
And then it's Nautilus.
Yeah.
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 Less disturbed.
Yes, the islands are.
So they showed cord.
We're attractive.
Cord wrap stick
Places where people
some
spend most of their
dentate, right?
time. Yeah. Hell Island is another one where we see a lot of ceramics. Hell Island and Stop Bay. I don't know that. Where? I don't even know. Okay. I would aspects, so that's pretty rich area.
Someone says, thanks, Bonnie, for sharing your research about this pottery.
Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah, we made it work with virtual people and in-person people, so that's great. And don't hesitate if you have questions to email me. You can find me on the Maine website. Thank you very much.
All right, stopping the recording.
Do you ever